London, 1855. The grand ballroom of Hartwell House gleamed with the light of 100 crystal chandeliers, casting golden reflections upon silk gowns and polished silver as the cream of society whirled through intricate dance patterns on the marble floor below. Lady Emiline Thornfield sat alone at the periphery, her slender fingers nervously smoothing the pale blue silk of her gown as she pretended not to notice the whispers that followed her like persistent shadow. At 25, she had already fallen from grace in the eyes of the ton, her broken engagement to Viscount Pembroke having transformed her from desired debutante to cautionary tale in a single season. The wound felt particularly raw tonight as she glimpsed her cousin, now the Viscountess Pembroke, floating across the dance floor in the arms of the man who had once pledged himself to Emiline. The heavy perfume of exotic flowers combined with the heat of too many bodies pressed her like a physical weight, making it difficult to maintain the serene expression expected of a lady. Her dance card remained desolately empty, save for obligatory dances with elderly uncles and her father's ancient friends, men who partnered her from duty rather than desire. Lady Wexford passed behind her chair, her voice carrying with deliberate clarity as she remarked to her companion how Emiline was damaged goods now. Such a shame with the prospects she once had. Emiline kept her chin lifted despite the flush of humiliation that crept up her neck, her knuckles whitening around her fan as she fought to maintain composure. She had been foolish to come tonight, to believe that 7 months might have softened society's judgment or dulled their appetite for scandal. The orchestra struck up another waltz, and couples formed on the floor while Emiline remained seated, invisible except when serving as the subject of pitying glances or malicious gossip. She caught her mother watching from across the room, disappointment evident in the tight line of her mouth. The season had barely commenced, yet already the familiar pattern had established itself. Invitations would arrive, proper and plentiful due to her family's connections, but once at these gatherings, she would become a ghost, present but unseen except as an object of derision. What hurt most was not the loss of the Viscount himself, for their engagement had been more arrangement than romance, but rather the loss of her place, her purpose, her future as she had always imagined it would be. Now she existed in a liminal space, neither debutante nor wife, a woman with no defined role in a society that demanded absolute conformity. As the music swelled and laughter rippled through the crowd, Emiline made a silent promise to herself. After tonight, she would no longer subject herself to this exquisite torture. She had another sanctuary, one where worth was measured by care and knowledge rather than marriageability or social standing. Tomorrow she would return to her greenhouse, the glass kingdom her father had built, where exotic blooms thrived under her attention and no plant had ever rejected her for a prettier specimen. Morning light filtered through the glass panes of Thornfield House greenhouse in dappled patterns across the stone pathway as Emiline stepped inside, inhaling deeply the humid, earthy scent that always calmed her fractured nerves. The magnificent structure stretched before her, a cathedral of glass and iron filled with treasures far more precious to her than the jewels and titles that obsessed London society. Her late father, the renowned botanist Sir William Thornfield, had built this sanctuary over 2 decades, gradually filling it with specimens from every corner of the British Empire until it rivaled the collections at Kew Gardens. Slipping off her shawl, Emiline moved deeper into the verdant embrace of ferns and palms, feeling the weight of last night lifting with each step away from the main house, where her mother still sighed over breakfast, lamenting her daughter who at 25 remained unmarried and now seemingly unmarriageable. Among these plants, Emiline transformed. Her movements grew confident, her eyes sharp and knowing as she checked each specimen with practiced efficiency, noting a yellowing leaf here, a promising new bud there. She mixed soil with bare hands, unconcerned with the dirt beneath her fingernails that would horrify Lady Wexford and her ilk. The rare Vanda coerulia orchid her father had acquired from the misty mountains of India 3 years before his death required particular attention this morning. Its delicate blue petals were unfurling in a perfect symphony of color against the deep green leaves. Emiline knelt before it, her skilled fingers gently supporting the flower stem as she examined the progress of its bloom. "At least you do not care about scandals or marriage prospects," she whispered to the delicate bloom. "You ask only for care and patience." The words lingered in the humid air, a truth that comforted her wounded spirit. Here in this glass kingdom, she was neither failed fiancée nor pitiable spinster, but caretaker and guardian, roles she fulfilled with unquestionable competence. Her father had recognized her gift when she was barely 7, taking her small hand in his weathered one as he taught her about cross-pollination and soil acidity, botanical Latin and grafting techniques. While her mother had fretted about her unladylike enthusiasm for such scientific pursuits, Sir William had encouraged her, leaving his botanical journals and specimen catalogues to Emiline upon his death 3 years ago. Now the greenhouse flourished under her stewardship, a living monument to their shared passion. She moved methodically through the collection, watering, pruning, making notes in the leather-bound journal that tracked each plant life cycle. The temperature rose as the morning advanced, but Emiline barely noticed, lost in the peaceful rhythm of caretaking. Here was a world that operated on principles of growth and nurture rather than malicious whispers and social calculations, a realm where her knowledge and dedication mattered more than her marriageability or the scandal that had redefined her place in society. The greenhouse had always been her refuge, but since the broken engagement, it had become her salvation. The one place where she could simply be herself without judgment or pity. The Duke of Westmoreland scowled at his reflection in the carriage window as it rolled through London streets, the familiar skyline of his homeland, strange after years abroad in the far reaches of the British Empire. Alexander Blackwood had returned to England not by choice but by duty, the death of his uncle having elevated him from second son to ducal heir in one cruel stroke of fate. His tall frame felt constrained not merely by the elegant evening attire his valet had insisted upon, but by the very air of London society with its stifling rules and transparent ambitions. Lady Margaret Blackwood, his younger sister by 2 years, and now the Countess of Harwick, sat opposite him in the carriage, studying his brooding countenance with a mixture of affection and exasperation. "You cannot live among plants forever, Alexander," she admonished as he adjusted his cravat for the 3rd time with obvious discomfort. "The dukedom requires an heir, which necessitates a duchess." The simple statement hung between them, an unwelcome truth he had successfully avoided during his botanical expeditions across India, Ceylon, and the furthest reaches of Africa. Alexander fixed his sister with penetrating green eyes, the same shade as the jungle canopies he had studied with far more interest than he now regarded the prospect of matrimony. "I find plants infinitely more tolerable than the matchmaking mamas of the ton," he replied, his deep voice carrying the crisp precision of a man accustomed to categorizing the natural world with scientific accuracy. At 38, the Duke cut an imposing figure despite his reluctance to embrace his new social position. His skin was bronzed from tropical suns, his frame lean and powerful from years traversing difficult terrain, his dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. Where other nobles returned from colonial posts with trophies of hunted beasts, Alexander had shipped crates of carefully preserved plant specimens, detailed journals of botanical observations, and living samples that now filled the massive greenhouse complex at Westmoreland Estate. The carriage arrived at the Harwick townhouse where his sister was hosting a select gathering, ostensibly to welcome him home, though Alexander recognized it for what it truly was, the first salvo in her campaign to see him properly wed. As the footman opened the door, Lady Margaret placed a gentle hand on her brother's sleeve. "At least make an effort tonight," she pleaded softly. "Mother has invited only the most appropriate families." Alexander sighed, the weight of his title settling more heavily upon his shoulders than any expedition pack had ever done. Appropriate. The word itself revealed the fundamental problem. For he had spent a lifetime feeling thoroughly inappropriate in the ballrooms and drawing rooms of society, his mind more engaged with photosynthesis than flirtation, pollination patterns than social patterns. As they entered the brightly lit townhouse, faces turned toward him with the predictable mixture of curiosity, calculation, and hopeful speculation that always accompanied a wealthy bachelor, particularly one wearing a ducal coronet. Alexander straightened his shoulders and donned the cold, impassive expression that had served him well in colonial outposts and academic circles alike. The botanist might have returned to England soil, but the Duke had arrived in London, and society would soon discover that Alexander Blackwood classified human specimens with the same detached precision he applied to his beloved plants, finding most wanting in comparison to the honest simplicity of the natural world. The great exhibition hall of the Royal Botanical Society gleamed beneath its magnificent glass dome, spring sunlight filtering through to illuminate the extraordinary collection of flora gathered from across the British Empire for the annual showcase of botanical wonders. Lady Emiline Thornfield moved through the exhibition with practiced ease, the gentle weight of her Uncle Edmund hand upon her arm as they navigated past displays that attracted London society more for their social opportunities than scientific merit. Lord Edmund Thornfield, at 76 a founding member of the society and respected botanist in his own right, had insisted on her accompaniment despite her reluctance to face society. "The greenhouse at Thornfield House offers superior specimens, Uncle," she had protested, but secretly felt grateful for his insistence as she breathed in the comforting scent of damp earth and vegetative life that permeated the hall. While her elderly uncle greeted colleagues, Emiline drifted toward a display of tropical specimens recently arrived from the northern provinces of India. She studied the identification card beneath an exquisite orchid, her brow furrowing as she noted the error. "This is most certainly not Paphiopedilum spicerianum," she murmured to the young guide, explaining the display to several disinterested society ladies. Without thought for propriety, she continued, "The spatulate petals and distinctive coloration clearly identify this as Cypripedium fairieanum, exceedingly rare since its discovery in the Himalayan foothills 7 years ago." The guide stammered, clearly unprepared for correction, when a deep voice from behind her confirmed, "Cypripedium fairieanum." Emiline turned, finding herself face to face with a tall gentleman whose penetrating green eyes assessed her with startling intensity. Both reached simultaneously to indicate the distinctive marking on the orchid petal, their gloved hands brushing accidentally. She withdrew hers instantly, a flush warming her cheeks as recognition dawned. The gentleman before her was none other than the recently returned Duke of Westmoreland, whose botanical expeditions were legendary among serious horticulturalists. "You know orchids, miss?" he inquired, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to academic discourse rather than social pleasantries. "Lady Emiline Thornfield, Your Grace," she supplied with a small curtsy. "And yes, rather better than I know appropriate conversation topics for young ladies, I am afraid." Something flickered in the Duke Green gaze, a spark of interest at her self-deprecating honesty. Lord Edmund approached, delight evident in his weathered features at finding his niece in conversation with the famed botanist Duke. "Blackwood, you rogue! "Finally returned from your tropical adventures?" he exclaimed, clapping the younger man on the shoulder with the familiarity of old academic associates. "I see you have met my niece, the finest amateur botanist in London, though she insists on hiding her light under a bushel." The Duke's expression softened marginally at Edmund's enthusiasm. "Lady Emiline was just correcting a rather egregious misidentification," he replied, his gaze returning to study her with the same careful attention he might give a rare specimen. For her part, Emiline found herself similarly cataloguing the Duke's imposing features, noting the sun-bronzed complexion that spoke of years in tropical climes, the calloused hands visible beneath his fine gloves suggesting practical work rather than merely theoretical knowledge. The air between them seemed charged with a current of mutual recognition, two minds accustomed to classification immediately recognizing a kindred spirit. Neither acknowledged this connection aloud, maintaining the proper distance of new acquaintances, yet both understood implicitly that something extraordinary had just occurred among the ordinary social rituals of the botanical exhibition. A rare specimen of understanding had taken root in the most unexpected soil. 3 days after their chance meeting at the botanical exhibition, the morning tranquility of Thornfield House was disrupted by the arrival of an elegant carriage bearing the Westmoreland ducal crest upon its gleaming doors. The unannounced visitor caused an immediate flurry among the household staff, culminating in the butler presenting a silver salver to Lady Emiline as she sat in the morning room with her mother. Upon the tray rested an exquisitely crafted invitation card alongside a small wooden box lined with damp moss containing several delicate flower cuttings. His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland, extends his compliments to Lady Emiline Thornfield and requests the honour of her company at Westmoreland House to view His Grace recently arrived botanical collection from the Indian subcontinent. The butler intoned with unprecedented reverence as Lady Catherine Thornfield abandoned all pretense of composure to snatch up the card. The formal script continued with a proposed date for the following week, suggesting that Lady Emiline might wish to bring an appropriate companion. His Grace Secretary added that the Duke thought you might appreciate these specimens in advance of your visit. The butler concluded, indicating the rare cuttings nestled in their protective bed. Lady Catherine stared at her daughter with undisguised calculation, years of social disappointment giving way to sudden, fervent hope. "The Duke of Westmoreland, Emiline," she breathed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed excitement. "One of the wealthiest peers in England, a dukedom dating back to William the Conqueror. But why has he singled you out, my dear?" Emiline lifted the box of cuttings, recognizing immediately the extraordinary nature of the gift. "These are rare dendrobium variants," she explained softly, specimens previously unknown to English collections. She understood the significance beyond their botanical value. The Duke had remembered their brief conversation about propagation techniques for tropical orchids, revealing thoughtfulness beneath his forbidding exterior that few would suspect. Within hours, news of the invitation had spread throughout Mayfair, drawing rooms and gentlemen clubs. Lady Emiline Thornfield, the same young woman who had been all but invisible at Lady Hartwell ball, suddenly found herself the subject of intense speculation. Why would England's most eligible bachelor, known for his indifference to the marriage mart, single out a woman whose reputation had been tarnished by a broken engagement? Some suggested botanical knowledge, others whispered of more scandalous connections. For Lady Catherine, the invitation represented potential social redemption, the possibility that her daughter might yet make an advantageous match despite past disappointments. For Emiline herself, the invitation elicited conflicted emotions, genuine excitement at the prospect of viewing specimens no other amateur botanist in England had accessed, warred with dread of the renewed attention. She had found peace in her social invisibility, painful though it had been. Now, whether the Duke intended it or not, His attention had thrust her back into the glaring light of ton scrutiny. That evening, as Emiline carefully prepared routing medium for the precious cuttings, she wondered at the Duke's motivation. Had he recognized in her merely a fellow enthusiast with whom to share his botanical treasures, or was there something more personal in the gesture? The invitation itself offered no clues, its formal language revealing nothing of the man behind the title. Yet the gift of the cuttings, delicate living things requiring care and knowledge, suggested a level of esteem and consideration she had not experienced since her father's death. Whatever his intentions, the Duke of Westmoreland had succeeded in one thing. He had made Lady Emiline Thornfield, long accustomed to being society-overlooked bloom, the subject of every conversation in London. The morning of Lady Emile's visit to Westmoreland House dawned with unseasonable clarity, spring sunshine warming the cobblestones of Mayfair as her carriage approached the imposing Portland stone facade. Lady Augusta Thornfield, her father's elder sister, and a formidable spinster, whose scientific interests had similarly rendered her unmarriageable by society standards, accompanied Emiline as her chaperone. The older woman squeezed her niece's hand encouragingly as they were admitted by livered footmen into a marble entrance hall adorned with botanical specimens preserved under glass rather than the expected ancestral portraits. The Duke himself awaited them, his tall figure silhouetted against the light streaming through tall windows. Lady Thornfield, Lady Emiline. He greeted them with a formal bow, his expression serious, yet holding a warmth absent in their previous meeting. After brief pleasantries, he guided them through the house toward what he referred to simply as the conservatory. Nothing in his understated description prepared Emiline for the magnificent structure that stretched behind Westmoreland House, dwarfing her family greenhouse as a cathedral might overshadow a village church. Entering through carved wooden doors, Emiline could not contain a soft gasp of wonder. The massive greenhouse stretched before them, a world unto itself divided into climate zones, maintaining precise conditions for specimens from every corner of the globe. Stone pathways wound through jungle-like growth, past bubbling streams and small ponds where exotic water plants flourished. Lady Augusta, equally transfixed, immediately engaged one of the Duke botanical assistants in conversation about irrigation systems, leaving Emiline effectively alone with their host. The Duke watched her face as she took in the splendor of his collection, a hint of pleasure breaking through his reserved demeanor at her evident appreciation. "The dendrobium cuttings I sent? Have they taken root?" he inquired, leading her deeper into the tropical section where orchids in impossible colors and shapes cascaded from specially designed supports. "Yes, Your Grace," Emiline replied, her initial nervousness fading as she described the rooting medium she had prepared. Their conversation flowed naturally into propagation techniques and cross-pollination, Emiline forgetting societal constraints as her face animated with genuine passion while explaining an experimental method she had developed for coaxing reluctant species to bloom in English conditions. "You speak of these plants as if they were old friends," the Duke observed, his penetrating gaze studying her with the same careful attention he might give a rare specimen. "Perhaps because they judge me only by the care I provide, not by mistakes in my past," she answered, the vulnerable admission slipping out before she could recall it. Instead of the awkward silence such personal revelation usually prompted, the Duke nodded in understanding. "Society demands performances I have little taste for," he replied, his deep voice softening as he gently supported a hanging orchid branch that had nearly brushed her shoulder. "Here at least one can be authentic." The simple statement created a profound connection between them, an acknowledgement of shared sanctuary. As they continued through the greenhouse, their conversation deepened beyond mere botanical exchange into a recognition of kindred spirits. The Duke explained his vision for creating a comprehensive catalogue of tropical specimens, his voice gaining animation when describing night blooms he had witnessed in remote Indian valleys. Emiline shared her father's documentation methods, offering suggestions for preserving color accuracy in botanical illustrations. Lady Augusta, trailing at a discreet distance, observed with knowing eyes the natural harmony between her niece and the supposedly forbidding Duke. For his part, Alexander Blackwood found himself increasingly drawn to this unusual young woman whose knowledge matched her passion, whose eyes lit with the same wonder he felt among his beloved specimens, and who seemed to understand without explanation his preference for the honest company of plants over the artificial constraints of society drawing rooms. The weeks following her visit to Westmoreland House saw a transformation in Lady Emiline Thornfield, as vibrant as the seasonal change overtaking London gardens. The carefully constructed walls of her isolation began to crumble beneath a daily exchange of correspondence with the Duke, each letter ostensibly focused on botanical matters, yet gradually revealing the minds and hearts behind the scholarly observations. Their exchange began formally, with the Duke sending a precise catalogue of his orchid varieties, along with queries about her propagation techniques for certain delicate specimens. Emiline responded with detailed sketches and cultivation notes that displayed not only her knowledge but her artistic talent. Soon their letters expanded beyond mere horticultural exchange. The Duke shared observations from his travels, describing remote valleys where rare flowers bloomed in isolation, untouched by human interference. Emiline wrote of her father's botanical philosophy, his belief that patience and careful observation revealed more truth than hasty classification. Without directly addressing personal matters, they revealed themselves through their perspectives on the natural world, their values evident in what they chose to notice and admire. Lady Catherine watched her daughter's transformation with calculating eyes, noting how Emiline now entered rooms with renewed confidence, how colour had returned to her cheeks, how she sometimes smiled at private thoughts while reading correspondence bearing the Westmoreland seal. Even more telling were the exotic specimens that arrived at regular intervals, each more rare and valuable than the last, each requiring knowledge few in England possessed to properly cultivate. Society, too, observed these developments with avid interest. Invitations that had dwindled to obligatory inclusiveness suddenly multiplied as hostesses sought the newly interesting Lady Emiline, hoping her presence might lure the reclusive Duke to their gatherings. At Lady Harwick's musical evening, Emiline found herself surrounded by young ladies and their mothers, all probing for information about the Duke preferences and habits. The gossip, however, grew increasingly pointed. At a dinner party hosted by the Marchioness of Westley, Emiline excused herself to the ladies' withdrawing room only to freeze outside the partially open door as she heard her name spoken. "The Duke merely uses her botanical knowledge," Lady Pembroke was saying, her voice carrying the edge that had once belonged to Emiline's closest friend before she became her replacement in the Viscount affections. He could never seriously consider damaged goods for a duchess. Whatever scientific curiosity she satisfies for him, it is merely that, curiosity. No man of his standing would ally himself with a woman rejected by a mere Viscount. The cruel assessment, delivered by the very woman who had caused her fall from grace, struck Emiline with fresh pain. That night, alone in her bedchamber, she unfolded the Duke's latest letter, a thoughtful analysis of cross-breeding possibilities for hardier tropical varieties. Reading between the carefully penned lines, she recognized a kindred spirit who found wonder in growth and beauty in adaptation. Yet Lady Pembroke's words echoed painfully in her mind. Had she misinterpreted his scientific interest as personal regard? Was she setting herself up for a second, more devastating rejection? Emiline pressed his letter between the pages of her botanical journal, trying to contain her growing feelings as effectively as she pressed flowers for preservation. The rational part of her mind urged caution, reminding her that dukes did not marry disgraced ladies regardless of shared interests. Yet her heart, so long dormant, had begun to bloom like one of her rare orchids, turning instinctively toward the light he had unexpectedly brought back into her carefully contained world. The night of the Westmoreland Conservatory ball arrived cloaked in anticipation so thick it seemed to hover like London fog over Mayfair. Society had spoken of little else for weeks, speculating endlessly about the reclusive Duke's sudden decision to host such a lavish gathering in his famous greenhouse rather than the traditional ballroom. Invitations, delivered on paper embedded with exotic flower seeds, had been coveted like royal warrants, their scarcity enhancing their value. Lady Emiline Thornfield stood at the entrance to the transformed conservatory, momentarily overwhelmed by the spectacle before her. The enormous glass structure had been illuminated with thousands of strategically placed candles in colored glass holders, casting rainbow hues across the tropical foliage. Floating platforms extended over the small ponds, creating additional space for guests while preserving the integrity of the botanical collection. Musicians played from a raised dais, nestled among towering palms, the strains of violins mingling with the gentle splash of artificial waterfalls. Lady Catherine practically vibrated with excitement beside her daughter, having spent an unprecedented sum on Emiline gown for the occasion, a creation of pale green silk embroidered with silver thread in patterns of unfurling ferns. The ton elite had already gathered, their finery an exotic display to rival the botanical wonders surrounding them. Whispers followed Emiline as her family made their way into the space. Speculation about her continued correspondence with the Duke and his unprecedented attention to a woman's society had largely dismissed. The anticipation reached its peak when Alexander Blackwood himself appeared, his commanding height and serious expression setting him apart from the decorative gentlemen of the ton. He moved through the crowd with purpose, stopping before Emiline with a formal bow. "Lady Emiline," he said, his deep voice carrying in the momentary lull of conversation, "would you do me the honor of the first dance?" The request, delivered with the same directness that characterized their correspondence, sent ripples of shock through the assembled guests. Emiline placed her gloved hand in his, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes following, as he led her to the center of the space cleared for dancing. As the music began, and they moved together among exotic blooms, the intimacy of the setting seemed to create a private world despite their public performance. "Why did you really invite me tonight, Your Grace?" she asked, emboldened by the magic of the moment and weeks of increasingly personal correspondence. The Duke studied her face carefully, his penetrating gaze more intense than ever in the flickering candlelight. "Because you see beauty in what others overlook," he answered simply, the words carrying weight beyond their apparent meaning. The charged moment hung between them, intimate despite the crowd, until a cutting voice intruded from nearby. "How fascinating to observe the Duke Botanical Charity case in her natural habitat," said Viscount Pembroke, his arm linked with her cousin, now his wife, who added with false sweetness, "One must admire His Grace scientific curiosity, studying such unusual specimen." Emiline felt the familiar flush of humiliation rise to her cheeks as nearby conversation stilled, the deliberate cruelty landing precisely as intended. Without conscious thought, she released the Duke hand and turned away, fleeing deeper into the greenhouse where the denser foliage offered concealment from prying eyes and whispered judgments. Behind her, she heard the Viscountess' tinkling laugh, followed by the deeper rumble of her former fiancé, their mockery penetrating even the sanctuary of rare blooms she had sought among the furthest reaches of the conservatory. Emiline sought refuge in the furthest corner of the conservatory, where the dense tropical specimens formed a natural barrier against intrusion. their broad leaves offering shelter as tangible as their familiar presence was comforting. The sound of the ball faded to a distant murmur beneath the gentle trickle of water feeding the most humidity-dependent plants. Here, the air hung heavy with moisture, and the sweet perfume of night-blooming flowers just beginning to unfurl their petals as darkness deepened beyond the glass walls. She pressed her palms against her burning cheeks, mortification warring with anger at her own foolishness for believing she might escape the shadow of scandal even in this botanical sanctuary. Lady Pembroke's cruel assessment echoed painfully in her mind. Charity case, an object of scientific curiosity rather than genuine regard. The rustle of leaves behind her signaled another presence before she heard his voice, quiet yet unmistakable. "They have always lacked imagination, Lady Emiline," the Duke said, remaining a respectful distance away, yet close enough that she could not pretend not to hear. "To see only titles and connections, to value only what society has deemed worthy, reveals a profound poverty of perception." Emiline turned slowly, composing her features into a mask of dignity, despite her inner turmoil. "Your Grace need not offer consolation," she replied, attempting to keep her voice steady. "I have grown accustomed to such remarks." The Duke stepped closer, moonlight filtering through the glass ceiling, illuminating the unusual vulnerability in his normally impassive features. "I was engaged once. In my youth," he said abruptly. The unexpected confession silencing her attempted dismissal. "She jilted me for a wealthier title when my father's debts came to light, before I restored our fortune. I learned then that society values position over person." The revelation hung in the humid air between them, his shared pain creating a bridge across which understanding might travel. "I had no idea," Emiline whispered, the formal address of his title forgotten in the intimacy of the moment. "Few do," he replied, his voice softening as he moved to stand beside her, close but not touching. "I found solace among my plants and travels, cataloguing species that thrived despite harsh conditions, that found ways to flourish in unlikely soil. The parallel to her own retreat into the botanical world after rejection remained unspoken yet perfectly understood. Around them, rare cereus flowers began opening their night blooms, their sweet fragrance intensifying in the enclosed space. Emiline became acutely aware of their isolation, hidden from the ball beyond, yet standing in a pool of moonlight that created an almost otherworldly intimacy. "Lady Emiline." "Emiline," the Duke said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he took her gloved hand in his. "Some treasures are overlooked because few have the wisdom to recognize their true value." The simple words held more healing power than any elaborate consolation could have offered. With unexpected tenderness, he raised her hand to his lips, the gesture both proper and startlingly intimate in its deliberate care. Through the fine silk of her glove, she felt the warmth of his breath, saw the unusual softness in his typically stern expression. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibility, as night-blooming flowers unfurled around them in silent witness. In that sheltered corner of his magnificent greenhouse, surrounded by plants that had traveled across oceans to find new life in foreign soil, something equally rare and precious was taking root between a woman society had discarded and a man who had never found his place within its narrow confines. The golden glow of their greenhouse connection dimmed in the harsh light of London society, as whispers that began at the conservatory ball grew into a storm of speculation and malice. Within days, the tentative understanding between Lady Emiline and the Duke became the subject of vicious rumors spreading through drawing rooms and gentlemen clubs with poisonous efficiency. No longer merely subjects of curiosity, they became targets of deliberate character assassination. Anonymous caricatures appeared in society papers, crude illustrations showing Lady Emiline as a scheming botanical temptress, her vine-like arms ensnaring a helpless ducal butterfly with nets fashioned from botanical journals. Another depicted her as a withered plant desperately seeking revival through aristocratic watering, her roots reaching for the Westmoreland fortune beneath the soil. Lady Catherine, initially elated by her daughter renewed social relevance, now fluctuated between rage at the attacks and fear that Emiline had indeed overreached her station, potentially ruining any chance of respectable rehabilitation. Even the Thornfield greenhouse, once her sanctuary, provided little comfort as callers arrived not to view the botanical collection, but to fish for gossip beneath the thinnest veil of social propriety. The most devastating blow came when Lady Margaret Harwick, the Duke's sister and strongest familial connection, requested a private meeting with Emiline. The Countess, elegant and direct like her brother, wasted no time on pleasantries. "My brother has always been guided by intellectual curiosity rather than social wisdom," Lady Harwick explained with cold precision. "Your botanical knowledge fascinates him, but surely you understand the unsuitability of any deeper connection. The dukedom requires an alliance that strengthens its position, not one that invites ridicule." The words, delivered without overt cruelty, yet devastating in their clarity, confirmed every doubt that had plagued Emiline since their first meeting. That evening, she penned a letter to the Duke, her normally steady hand trembling slightly as she committed to paper the hardest words she had ever written. "Your friendship has restored my confidence in my botanical abilities, if not in society judgments," she wrote after formal pleasantries. "But I cannot, in good conscience, allow that friendship to tarnish your standing among peers whose respect you require to further your scientific endeavors. Some plants thrive better in solitude, drawing strength from their isolation rather than weakening the garden around them. Perhaps I am such a specimen." The letter continued with practical notes about the specimens they had been discussing, maintaining the facade of purely scientific correspondence while gently but firmly closing the door on anything more personal. Emiline sealed it with wax before her courage could falter, dispatching it immediately via messenger to ensure no opportunity for reconsideration. In the days that followed, she retreated fully to her family greenhouse, finding solace in the familiar routines of cultivation and documentation, even as her heart ached with fresh loss. No response came from Westmoreland House. No rare specimens arrived to be nurtured. No invitations to view new acquisitions. The silence confirmed her decision as both necessary and final. Society, having feasted on the scandal, gradually lost interest as new gossip emerged to capture their fleeting attention. Lady Emiline Thornfield returned to her previous state of social invisibility, present but unseen at the few gatherings her mother still insisted upon attending. If observers noted that she seemed more withdrawn than before, her eyes lacking the animation that had briefly illuminated them during her association with the Duke, none cared enough to mention it. Westmoreland House fell into uncharacteristic silence in the days following Lady Emiline withdrawal, the usual bustle of scientific assistants and gardeners continuing their work, while the Duke retreated into unaccustomed solitude. Alexander Blackwood stood alone in the central chamber of his vast conservatory, surrounded by the most precious specimens from his global expeditions, rare blooms that scholars traveled hundreds of miles to examine, yet found himself unable to summon the enthusiasm that had previously animated his scientific pursuits. Each plant, meticulously catalogued and positioned for optimal growth, seemed diminished somehow, as if their colors had faded and their remarkable adaptations grown commonplace. He moved methodically through his daily inspection, noting conditions and development with scientific precision, but without the spark of wonder that had previously driven his botanical obsessions. A bloom he had awaited for months, a rare Himalayan species that flowered only once every 7 years, had opened during the night, its delicate petals unfurling in a perfect spiral of cream and palest pink. In times past, such an event would have occasioned immediate documentation, perhaps a gathering of fellow botanists to witness the fleeting miracle. Now he found himself simply staring at it, his first thought not of scientific recording, but of how Emiline eyes would have widened at the sight, how her quick mind would have observed details others might miss, how her presence would have transformed solitary appreciation into shared wonder. Lady Margaret found her brother thus, standing motionless before the rare bloom, lost in contemplation that clearly had nothing to do with botany. "I have never seen you so affected by any person, Alexander," she observed, studying his profile with newfound understanding. "Not even when Elizabeth jilted you did you withdraw so completely." The Duke did not immediately respond, his gaze still fixed on the perfect flower whose brief glory would fade within days, leaving only scientific notation to mark its existence. "Because I have never met anyone who sees the world as I do," he replied finally, his voice low but resolute, "who values substance over appearance and authenticity over pretense." His sister shifted uncomfortably, guilt flickering briefly across her aristocratic features. "I spoke with Lady Emiline," she admitted. "I may have suggested that her connection to you invited ridicule and threatened your standing. I believed I was protecting you, the family name." The Duke turned to face her fully, his expression more open than she had seen it since their childhood. "From what, Margaret? From genuine connection. From the first person who has ever looked at me and seen Alexander rather than Westmoreland. From someone who understands my work not as eccentric indulgence, but as meaningful pursuit. Her letter, so carefully composed to release me from obligation while preserving my dignity, reveals more true nobility than all the aristocratic marriages you would have me consider." Lady Margaret stared at her brother, seeing him anew in the light of this unexpected eloquence. For years she had pushed him toward suitable alliances, never considering that what he sought might lie beyond the narrow confines of their social circle. "Is she truly so remarkable, this botanist lady?" she asked softly. The Duke considered the question with the same careful attention he gave to scientific classification. "She sees wonder where others see oddity, strength where others see strangeness. She understands that true value often lies hidden beneath unremarkable exteriors." He moved toward the propagation tables, where specimens from around the world grew from unlikely beginnings into extraordinary forms. "For 20 years I have traveled the globe collecting botanical treasures," he continued, while overlooking the rarest bloom of all, one that somehow took root and flourished in the hostile soil of London society. "Society approval means nothing if it requires sacrificing true happiness, Margaret. I will not make that bargain, not for the dukedom, not for our family name, not for anything." His sister recognized the tone, the same implacable determination that had driven him through unmapped jungles and across treacherous mountain passes in pursuit of botanical knowledge. She had never thought to hear it applied to matters of the heart, had never imagined her scientifically minded brother capable of such depth of feeling. "What will you do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Westmoreland, straightened his shoulders and for the first time in weeks smiled with genuine warmth. "I believe, Margaret, that I shall go in search of a most particular English flower that has retreated into hiding, and I shall not rest until I have persuaded it to bloom once more, this time in soil where it will be properly valued." The greenhouse at Thornfield House stood like a crystal island amid the relentless autumn rain that had fallen across London for 3 days without cessation. Water streamed down the glass panes, transforming the outside world into a blurred watercolor painting, while inside remained a haven of controlled climate and meticulous order. Emiline knelt beside a wooden potting bench, her practical gardening dress already bearing the evidence of the morning work as she carefully separated root clusters of common English primroses, finding purpose in the mundane task after weeks of avoiding the more exotic specimens that carried too many painful associations. The steady patter of rainfall against glass created a soothing rhythm that almost masked the sound of the greenhouse door opening, then closing with a soft click. When she looked up, Alexander Blackwood stood just inside the entrance, rainwater running from his greatcoat onto the stone floor. For a moment, Emiline wondered if she had conjured him from her thoughts, a phantom born of longing rather than flesh and blood. "Your Grace?" she managed, rising quickly and brushing soil from her hands, an unexpected honor. The Duke stepped further into the greenhouse, his tall figure seeming to fill the space that had previously felt so capacious. He removed his hat, droplets of rain falling from its brim as his penetrating gaze took in her work-stained apron and loosened hair with an intensity that made her heart quicken against her will. "Lady Emiline," he began, then stopped, something uncharacteristically uncertain in his normally commanding demeanor. "In our correspondence, you once told me that plants judge only by the care they receive, not by appearance or society standing." His voice gained strength as he continued, advancing slowly down the center aisle of the greenhouse until only the wooden potting bench separated them. "I have spent my life cataloging and classifying the natural world, seeking to understand the remarkable diversity of creation. I have collected specimens from across the globe, yet found no treasure as rare or precious as you." Emiline stared at him, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as if it might anchor her against the tide of emotion his words unleashed. "Alexander, please," she whispered. "We both know that society would never accept such a connection. The caricatures, the whispers, they would only grow worse." In response, the Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a small ceramic pot containing an orchid unlike any Emiline had ever seen. Its blooms displaying an impossible combination of colors, half deep burgundy and half pristine white, merged so perfectly they appeared as two distinct flowers growing from a single stem. "I developed this hybrid myself," he said, placing the pot carefully on the bench between them. Two different natures thriving together, creating something unique and extraordinary through their unlikely union. Then, to her astonishment, the Duke of Westmoreland, heir to one of England's oldest titles and master of vast estates, knelt beside her potting bench, heedless of the damp soil staining his immaculate trousers, and took her work-roughened hand in his. "I ask for the privilege of caring for you, Emiline, of growing alongside you for all our days, of creating together a life as remarkable and unlikely as this bloom, one that defies convention but flourishes nonetheless." The greenhouse around them seemed to fade away as Emiline gazed into eyes that had traveled the world, yet now looked at her as if she were the greatest wonder they had ever beheld. Through the glass roof, a sudden shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating them in a private radiance that seemed separate from the continued rainfall. The dual-colored orchid between them caught the light, its impossible beauty a testament to what could emerge when nature defied expected boundaries. The formal announcement of Lady Emiline Thornfield's engagement to His Grace, Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Westmoreland, appeared in the morning papers 3 days after his greenhouse proposal, causing a sensation that rippled through London society with the force of a summer thunderstorm. Drawing rooms and breakfast tables buzzed with speculation, some expressing genuine surprise that the botanical duke had finally chosen a bride, others whispering maliciously about Emiline's supposed scheming to secure such an advantageous match, despite her tarnished reputation. Lady Catherine fluctuated between triumphant pride and nervous anxiety, fearing some last-minute scandal might yet derail her daughter's unexpected social redemption. The Duke's sister, Lady Harwick, having witnessed her brother transformation from scientific recluse to devoted suitor, threw her considerable social influence behind the match, hosting an elegant engagement dinner where the couple would make their first public appearance since the announcement. The Harwick townhouse glittered with candlelight as the cream of society arrived, curiosity overcoming any reservations about the unconventional pairing. Emiline entered on her betrothed arm, her simple gown of deep blue silk setting off the magnificent Westmoreland sapphires at her throat, her face animated with a confidence few had ever witnessed in the formerly reserved Lady Thornfield. Together they formed a striking couple, his imposing height and serious demeanor balanced by her quiet grace and the subtle communication that passed between them without words. Lady Margaret had arranged the seating with diplomatic precision, placing the couple at sufficient distance from potential detractors while surrounding them with allies and neutral parties. Yet even her careful planning could not prevent the inevitable confrontation when guests mingled before dinner. The Duchess of Pemberton, Emiline cousin, and the woman who had married her former fiancé, approached with the determined smile of a predator scenting weakness. "How fortunate for you that the Duke values plants above bloodlines," she remarked in a voice pitched to carry to nearby guests, her words coated in false sweetness that barely disguised their poison. 6 months earlier, such a barb would have pierced Emiline to the core, leaving her wounded and retreating. Now she regarded her cousin with newfound serenity, no longer defined by past rejection or social judgment. How fortunate indeed that he values substance over appearances and genuine passion over social convenience, she replied, her voice calm, yet carrying the quiet authority she had developed in her botanical domain. "I have discovered, cousin, that the rarest blooms often develop in the most unexpected conditions." The Duke, overhearing as he approached with refreshments for his betrothed, added in tones that could have frosted the champagne glasses, "Quite fortunate that I recognized a treasure others foolishly overlooked." His penetrating gaze swept over the Viscount who had appeared at his wife's side, then returned to Emiline with unmistakable admiration. The finest specimens are often passed over by those lacking the wisdom to recognize their true value. The unified response, delivered without anger, yet leaving no room for further attack, created a momentary silence in the surrounding conversations. The Duchess of Pemberton flushed, opening her mouth to reply before thinking better of it as she registered the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the evaluating glances now directed at her rather than at Emiline. The exchange marked a turning point in society perception, as witnesses observed not the scandalous misalliance they had expected, but a couple whose genuine connection and mutual respect were evident in every glance and word. By the time the engagement dinner concluded, the narrative had begun its transformation, the story of the botanical Duke and his unexpected choice evolving from object of derision to romantic tale of authentic connection, transcending social convention. At Westmoreland Estate, the summer sun bathed the expanded greenhouse complex in golden light, its glass and iron structures gleaming like enormous jewels across the sweeping lawns. 2 years had transformed what was already an impressive botanical collection into world-renowned gardens that rivaled Kew itself, drawing scientists and aristocrats from across Europe to marvel at specimens previously unseen on English soil. The Duchess of Westmoreland moved with natural grace among distinguished visitors, her expert knowledge evident as she explained the native conditions of rare Amazonian bromeliads to an enthralled professor from Berlin. The same society that had once whispered cruel judgments now watched in fascinated admiration as Lady Emiline Blackwood fulfilled her role with an authenticity that made traditional duchesses seem pallid by comparison. Where other noble wives directed servants from a distance, Emiline worked alongside her botanists, her fingers occasionally bearing soil beneath immaculate nails, her scientific papers published under her own name in respected journals across the continent. The Duke paused in the doorway of the tropical pavilion, his heart swelling as he observed his wife cradling their 4-month-old son among the vibrant blooms. The infant, Henry William Blackwood, future Duke of Westmoreland, gazed with wide eyes at a particularly spectacular orchid his mother had cultivated from a cutting brought back from Burma by one of their sponsored expeditions. Alexander crossed the warm space to join his family, placing a gentle hand on his son's dark hair, the same shade as his own. "Our rarest specimen," he murmured, kissing Emmeline's forehead with the natural affection that still caused older members of society to raise eyebrows before they recalled that this most unusual ducal couple had never much concerned themselves with convention. "And the most beloved," he added, his typically stern features softening as they always did in the presence of his wife and child. Emiline leaned against her husband's broad shoulder, savoring the warmth of his touch and the security of their family unit. From beyond the glass walls came the distant sounds of visiting nobility taking tea on the south lawn, their presence a testament to how completely her position had been established in the society that once rejected her. She recalled vividly the lonely figure she had once been, sitting forgotten at the edges of ballrooms, seeking solace among her plants, because human company offered only judgment. Now she moved confidently through both worlds, her expertise respected, her social position secure not through artificial conformity, but through the genuine respect she had earned. From solitary bloom to flourishing garden, she mused aloud, looking from their son to the thriving botanical kingdom they had created together, two passionate souls who had recognized in each other what society had overlooked. The Duke nodded in understanding, his arm tightening around her waist as he surveyed the garden that represented their shared vision. Together they had expanded beyond mere collection to active cultivation, sending expeditions to remote regions, establishing correspondence with botanists across continents, and most revolutionary of all, opening their gardens to serious students, regardless of social standing. The Duke of Westmoreland had married his unsuitable bride, despite predictions of social ruin, and instead had created something far more valuable than mere social acceptance, a partnership that enriched not only their own lives, but advanced scientific knowledge itself. Young Henry wriggled in his mother's arms, reaching pudgy fingers toward a cascade of golden orchids, his inherent curiosity already evident despite his tender age. Emiline laughed, the sound carrying across the greenhouse, drawing smiles from visitors who observed the family tableau with appreciation for its evident harmony. The woman once deemed damaged goods had blossomed into the most unlikely of duchesses, not by conforming to expectations, but by remaining true to the authentic self that her husband had recognized and cherished from their very first meeting among mislabeled specimens. Together they had created not merely a conventional aristocratic union, but a genuine partnership, proving that the rarest and most beautiful blooms often developed in the most unexpected conditions, nurtured by mutual respect and shared passion rather than the artificial constraints of society expectations. As twilight descended over Westmoreland Estate, the last carriage bearing visiting dignitaries disappeared down the elm-lined drive, leaving the Duke and Duchess to their private evening ritual. Alexander took Emmeline's hand as they strolled through the greenhouse complex, now softly illuminated by specially designed glass lanterns that cast a gentle glow over the botanical treasures without harming the more sensitive specimens. The transition from day to night brought its own magic as certain flowers closed while others began to unfurl. Night-blooming varieties releasing their sweet perfume into the humid air. They walked in comfortable silence, the kind that exists only between two people who understand each other so completely that words become secondary to the simple pleasure of shared presence. Their path led them to a special section near the heart of the original greenhouse, where dozens of dual-colored orchids now flourished on a dedicated wall, their striking burgundy and white blooms creating a living tapestry of harmonious contrast. The Duke and Duchess paused before the display, both remembering the single-potted specimen he had offered in place of a traditional engagement ring 2 years earlier. "Thornfield treasure," Emiline said softly, touching one perfect bloom with gentle fingers. The name they had given this new hybrid had now entered botanical catalogues across Europe, a testament to what could emerge when unexpected elements combined, from a single pot to an entire lineage. The Duke smiled, his typically stern features softening in the intimate light. "Like us," he observed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "What began as a connection between two solitary souls has expanded beyond anything I could have imagined." Emiline leaned against his shoulder, taking comfort in his solid presence, as she often did when reflecting on their journey. "Once I hid among plants because I felt rejected by the world," she mused, watching as a particularly magnificent specimen slowly opened its petals to the evening air. "Now we share them because we created our own world." Alexander turned to her, taking both her hands in his as he had on the day he proposed, his expression holding the same reverent wonder that had never diminished in their years together. "Some treasures are meant to be shared, others kept private in one heart," he said, his deep voice carrying the quiet certainty that had always been his hallmark. "You, my love, are both." She raised her face to his, the distance between them disappearing as naturally as day giving way to night. Their kiss, witnessed only by the exotic blooms surrounding them, held all the tenderness of new love and the deeper certainty of a connection, tested and proven against the harshest conditions. In finding each other, they had discovered not merely acceptance, but celebration of their true selves, creating together a life as unique and beautiful as the hybrid orchid that symbolized their union. As night fully claimed the world beyond the glass walls, the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland remained in their illuminated sanctuary. Two rare specimens who had defied classification to create something entirely new, a love that recognized value beyond superficial appearance, that celebrated authenticity rather than convention, and that continued to flourish in soil where both could grow toward their fullest potential.